Marcus Turner stood outside the back entrance of his flagship restaurant, Turner's Table, observing the waitstaff and kitchen workers darting in and out as the evening rush approached. The familiar hum of New York City traffic filled the air, but Marcus was focused, his mind racing through the numerous complaints he had received about Carol Simmons, the restaurant's manager. Staff had been leaving at an alarming rate, each exit interview echoing the same troubling themes: racism, abusive behavior, and shortcuts that were tarnishing the reputation of the business he had built from the ground up. This wasn't the first time Marcus had heard whispers of misconduct, but the specifics were unsettling. This time, Carol, his longtime manager who had been with him for years and oversaw one of his most profitable establishments, seemed different. She always appeared capable, efficient, and even charming during his visits, but he understood all too well how different a workplace could feel when the boss was absent. Marcus rubbed his close-shaved head, his jaw tight. This restaurant was meant to be a welcoming space for people from all backgrounds, whether customers or employees, yet the complaints made it evident that something was seriously amiss. He had contemplated confronting Carol directly, but experience had shown him that individuals like her, those who exploit their power, were skilled at concealing their tracks. She would have excuses prepared, polished explanations for every accusation. No, he needed to see it for himself. He had to go undercover. Earlier that week, Marcus quietly arranged with his head chef, Carlos, to hire a new dishwasher. Carlos was unaware of the full plan, only knowing that a new hire named Mark would be starting at the bottom. It wasn't the first time Marcus had gone undercover at one of his restaurants to assess operations, but this time felt personal. He exchanged his usual tailored suits for a worn hoodie, a pair of jeans, and a cap pulled low over his face. The final touch, a slightly stained apron, completed the disguise. He glanced at his reflection in the glass door. He looked nothing like the Marcus Turner who attended board meetings or posed for interviews. Tonight, he was just another worker trying to make a living. With one last breath, Marcus stepped inside through the back door. The kitchen was already buzzing with activity. Carlos, the sous chef, was shouting out orders while line cooks worked in synchronized chaos. The aroma of grilled meats, simmering sauces, and freshly baked bread filled the air. "Mark, right?" Carlos asked, wiping his hands on his apron before giving Marcus a quick once-over. "Glad you're here. We've got a busy night ahead. You'll be handling dish duty. Just make sure to keep up, okay?" Marcus nodded, his voice low to maintain the ruse. "Got it, chef." Carlos barely spared him another glance, moving on to the next task. That was good. It meant Marcus could observe without drawing too much attention. He glanced around, spotting the dishwashing station in the far corner, a pile of plates already waiting for him. He moved quickly, slipping into the rhythm of scrubbing plates and trays, his ears tuned to the conversations around him. It didn't take long for Marcus to hear Carol's voice, sharp and authoritative, even from across the kitchen. She carried herself like someone who expected complete control over her environment. As she entered, Marcus noticed the staff tense up. The lighthearted banter among the cooks and waiters vanished, replaced by quiet, focused work. Carol was a presence that stifled the room. He watched her as she made her rounds, inspecting the food, checking the plates before they went out, her eyes scanning everything for a reason to criticize. "That new kid better not be slacking already," she snapped, glancing at Marcus from the corner of her eye. He kept his head down, scrubbing dishes, pretending not to notice. But it was already evident that Carol wasn't just a tough manager. She ruled by intimidation, making her authority felt at every corner of the restaurant. Tonight was only the beginning. Marcus had much more to observe. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity as the evening service kicked into high gear. The clang of pots and pans echoed through the space, along with the occasional shout from the line cooks as orders flooded in. Marcus kept his head down at the dishwasher station, moving swiftly to keep up with the mountain of dirty plates stacking beside him. He scrubbed, rinsed, and loaded the dishes into the industrial washer, trying to blend in as much as possible. Even amidst the constant noise, he could feel the shift in energy when Carol Simmons strode into the kitchen. "Carlos, what's going on with that salmon? Table 6 has been waiting too long," she barked, her sharp voice cutting through the clamor of the kitchen. Carlos, who had been working swiftly with his team, didn't look up from the grill. "It's coming, Carol," he replied evenly, flipping a fillet with practiced precision. Carol glanced around, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. When her gaze landed on Marcus, she raised an eyebrow, her lips curling in slight disdain. She walked over, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Marcus could feel her eyes sizing him up, judging every detail from his old clothes to the way he worked. "And who's this?" she asked, her voice dripping with thinly veiled condescension. "Another one of your last-minute hires, Carlos?" Carlos looked up briefly and nodded in Marcus's direction. "Yeah, that's Mark. Just started today. He's doing dish duty for now." Carol's expression didn't soften. If anything, she looked irritated. She stepped closer to Marcus, crossing her arms as she inspected him. "You better not slow us down," she said, her tone a mix of warning and dismissal. "The last thing we need is another dishwasher who can't keep up with the pace." Marcus, keeping his head down and his voice low, replied simply, "I'll keep up, don't worry." But Carol wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that only Marcus could hear. "I've seen your type come and go," she sneered. "Don't think you'll last long here. If you're expecting special treatment, we run a tight ship, and I won't hesitate to send you packing if you screw up." Marcus felt a flicker of anger but kept it buried beneath a calm exterior. He knew Carol didn't recognize him, and that was exactly what he needed. Let her believe she was in control for now. "Understood," he muttered, keeping his tone neutral. Carol straightened up and walked away, her heels clicking once again as she moved toward the center of the kitchen. She didn't bother to look back at Marcus, clearly already dismissing him as insignificant. But he could feel the tension she brought into the room. The chatter among the kitchen staff had quieted, and everyone seemed to be moving just a little faster, a little more carefully, trying to avoid Carol's critical eye. Marcus kept working, his hands moving on autopilot as he rinsed and loaded the dishes, but his mind was racing. In just a few short minutes, Carol had shown her true colors. Her authority was built on fear and intimidation, not respect. She didn't care about fostering teamwork or making the kitchen a positive place to work. She was only interested in asserting her dominance, and Marcus could already see that her behavior was affecting the morale of the entire staff. As Marcus scrubbed another plate, he watched as Carol berated Sophia, one of the waitresses, for what seemed like a trivial mistake. Sophia, a petite Latina woman with weary eyes, was holding a tray of food, her hands trembling slightly as Carol stood over her. "You call this service?" Carol snapped, her voice rising above the clatter of the kitchen. "You can't even get the order right. How hard is it to carry a plate from point A to point B?" Sophia mumbled an apology, her face flushed with embarrassment. Carol wasn't satisfied. "If you can't handle it, maybe this job isn't for you," she added, her tone cold and dismissive. "We don't have time for incompetence." Marcus felt a surge of frustration. It wasn't just the harshness of Carol's words. It was the way she seemed to target people like Sophia, individuals who couldn't afford to lose their jobs. The way she spoke to Sophia was filled with a level of cruelty that was both unnecessary and revealing. As Carol moved on to her next victim, Marcus kept his eyes on the sink, letting the hot water wash over the dirty dishes. He could already see how deep the problem ran. This wasn't just about a tough manager trying to enforce discipline. This was about power, control, and prejudice. And Marcus knew he'd have to gather more evidence before confronting Carol. But what he'd seen so far was more than enough to confirm his worst fears. The night was just beginning, and already Marcus had witnessed more than he'd hoped for. It was clear that Carol Simmons was a problem he intended to fix. The hours dragged on as Marcus worked his way through stacks of dishes, his hands wrinkling from the hot water and soap. But it wasn't the physical labor that weighed on him. It was what he was witnessing. Carol's presence dominated the kitchen, and every time she appeared, the mood shifted. The easy banter between the line cooks and waitstaff vanished. Conversations fell silent. Workers moved with anxious precision as if one wrong step would provoke her wrath. Marcus scrubbed at a particularly greasy pan, his eyes focused on his task, but his ears attuned to the chaos around him. Carol had just walked back into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply on the tile floor, her voice already cutting through the noise. "Table 12's filet is overcooked," she snapped at Thomas, the head chef. "You know we can't afford mistakes with our high-paying customers." Thomas, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 30s, nodded curtly, his eyes fixed on the grill in front of him. Marcus noticed how Carol's tone softened just a touch when speaking to Thomas, who was one of the few white employees on the kitchen floor. But the difference she offered him was fleeting. Turning on her heel, Carol swept toward the service station where Sophia stood, struggling to keep up with the rapidly mounting orders. Sophia's hands fumbled as she balanced a tray of drinks in her hands. Marcus could see the fatigue on her face. She had been working for hours, but the weight of Carol's scrutiny seemed to sap any remaining energy she had. "God, can you move any slower?" Carol's voice was filled with venom as she closed the distance between them. "How many times do I have to tell you to be faster? You act like we're running a charity here." Sophia stammered an apology, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady the tray. I'm trying, Miss Simmons," Carol sneered, lowering her voice just enough so only Sophia could hear. "Try harder, because if you keep this up, you won't be working here much longer." Marcus could feel the tension radiating from Sophia, her shoulders stiffening under Carol's harsh words. He watched as she hurried back to the dining room, her head down, avoiding Carol's gaze as much as possible. Carol, on the other hand, turned back toward the kitchen staff, seemingly satisfied with herself. It wasn't just Sophia who faced Carol's wrath. The kitchen staff, most of whom were immigrants or people of color, were frequently on the receiving end of her abuse. Carlos, the sous chef, did his best to keep the team moving, but even he was visibly tense whenever Carol was nearby. "Carlos, how many times do I have to tell you to cut back on the portions?" Carol barked as she inspected a plate ready to go out. "This isn't a buffet. Cut it down. You're costing us money." Carlos nodded, though his jaw clenched. "Understood." Marcus observed it all in silence, each encounter reinforcing what he had already suspected. Carol wasn't just a tough boss. She was an outright bully, especially toward staff members she saw as vulnerable. And her focus on cutting corners, even at the cost of quality, was going to damage the restaurant's reputation sooner rather than later. Just as Marcus thought things couldn't get worse, Carol's next move made his blood boil. A dishwasher named Jorge had just arrived from his break, his shoulders slumped from a long shift. Carol was waiting for him, arms crossed. "You think you can just take an extra 5 minutes on your break, Jorge?" she snapped, her tone icy. "I don't care how tired you are. You do your job or I'll find someone else who can." Jorge opened his mouth to explain, but Carol cut him off before he could get a word in. "I don't want to hear any excuses," she hissed. "Get back to work or you're out of here." Jorge, clearly shaken, lowered his head and headed back to the dishwashing station. Marcus felt a pang of anger as he watched Carol turn her attention elsewhere, as if she hadn't just berated a man for no good reason. It was becoming clear by the minute that Carol saw her employees as disposable, especially those she deemed beneath her. The racist undertones in her comments, the way she singled out people like Sophia and Jorge, the constant pressure to cut corners and squeeze the most profit possible. It was all there, plain as day. Marcus's hands stilled on the dish he was scrubbing. He had enough evidence to see what kind of environment Carol had created here, and it was worse than he had imagined. The dinner rush had slowed slightly, giving the kitchen staff a moment to catch their breath. Marcus continued scrubbing dishes, his arms aching from the hours of labor, but his mind was still focused on what he had seen throughout the night. Carol's behavior was worse than he had anticipated, and with every cutting remark or unfair action, his frustration grew. Marcus was rinsing off a pot when the sharp sound of Carol's voice broke through the kitchen again. "Carlos!" Carol snapped, standing in front of the line, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What's going on with that chicken dish? It doesn't look right." Carlos, already exhausted from juggling the never-ending stream of orders, turned toward her. "It's fine, Carol. It's the usual roast chicken with the herb butter sauce, exactly how it's been made every night." Carol strode over to the plate waiting under the heat lamps and lifted the lid, inspecting it closely. "It's not fine. It's sloppy. Look at the sauce. It's too thin, and this chicken doesn't look right either." Marcus watched as Carlos's face tightened with frustration. "It's cooked perfectly. I checked it myself." Carol's eyes narrowed, a sly smile crossing her face. "Then you won't mind if I send it back to be redone, right? We can't serve anything subpar." She slid the plate to the edge of the counter, ready to toss it back into the kitchen for a complete redo. Carlos sighed, clearly trying to keep his cool, but it was obvious that Carol's micromanaging was starting to wear him down. Marcus, glancing at the plate as he walked by with a clean tray of dishes, saw nothing wrong with it. In fact, the chicken looked perfect, golden brown and tender. He could also tell that Carol's critique wasn't based on the dish's quality. It was just another power play. She wanted to assert her control, to remind Carlos and the rest of the staff who was in charge. As Carol continued to nitpick, Marcus couldn't stay silent anymore. Actually, Marcus spoke up, his voice calm but loud enough to catch Carol's attention. "The chicken looks good to me." The kitchen went dead silent. Carol turned to Marcus, her eyes narrowing as she registered his words. It was clear she didn't expect a dishwasher to voice an opinion, let alone challenge her in front of the staff. "What did you just say?" Carol asked, her voice icy. Marcus set down the tray he was holding and met her gaze, still playing the role of the humble dishwasher, but there was a firmness in his tone. "I said the dish looks fine. I've seen worse come out of other kitchens, and this looks like it's cooked perfectly. No need to throw it out." Quote, dot. Carol stared at him for a moment, disbelief flashing across her face. It was as if she couldn't comprehend that someone in Marcus's position would dare to question her. "You're a dishwasher," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you know better than the manager of this restaurant?" Marcus kept his cool. "I'm just saying it looks good enough to serve, that's all." A low murmur rippled through the kitchen. Some of the staff exchanged glances, clearly shocked at the boldness of Marcus's comment. Carol's face reddened, and her eyes flicked from Marcus to the rest of the kitchen, her jaw tightening. "I didn't ask for your opinion," she snapped, her voice sharp. "Your job is to clean dishes, not critique the food. If you want to keep that job, I suggest you stay in your lane." Quote, dot. Marcus didn't flinch under her glare, but he could sense the tension in the room thickening. Carlos, who had been silent through the exchange, finally spoke up, his tone measured. "He's right, Carol," Carlos said. "The dish is fine, no need to send it back." Carol shot Carlos a withering look but seemed to sense that she was outnumbered. With a frustrated sigh, she pushed the plate back toward the service counter. "Fine, send it out," she said through gritted teeth. "But if it comes back with a complaint, I'll be holding both of you responsible." With that, Carol turned on her heel and stalked off toward the dining area, her heels clicking against the floor as she went. The kitchen remained quiet for a few moments after she left, the staff exchanging glances, clearly still processing the brief confrontation. Carlos gave Marcus a grateful nod, though he didn't say anything. The tension gradually lifted, and the kitchen resumed its frantic pace. Marcus, though, knew that this was only the beginning. He had just challenged Carol's authority in a small way, and while she had backed down this time, it was clear that her temper and her ego wouldn't let this slide easily. As he returned to the dish pit, Marcus couldn't help but feel that the clock was ticking. Carol was bound to retaliate at some point, and when she did, he'd be ready. The evening rush had finally died down, and the kitchen staff began to clean up for the night. Exhausted, Marcus wiped his brow, grateful for the short break he'd been given. The weight of the long shift was heavy on his shoulders, but his mind was far more burdened by everything he had witnessed so far. It wasn't just Carol's attitude. It was the ripple effect her abuse had on everyone around her. Marcus made his way out to the narrow alley behind the restaurant where the staff took their breaks. The cool night air was a relief after the sweltering heat of the kitchen. As he leaned against the wall, taking in a few deep breaths, he heard footsteps approaching. Sophia, the waitress Marcus had seen Carol berate earlier, stepped outside. She glanced around nervously before lighting a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating her tired face. "Mind if I join you?" Marcus asked, his voice low and casual. Sophia looked at him for a moment, then shrugged, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Sure, it's not like Carol will give me hell for taking an extra 5 minutes, right?" Her tone was bitter, but there was also a hint of sarcasm. Marcus chuckled softly, though he could hear the pain behind her words. "Rough night?" Sophia scoffed, shaking her head. "Rough night? Try rough every night. Working with her is like walking on eggshells. You never know when she's going to snap." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I noticed. She doesn't exactly hold back." Sophia took another drag from her cigarette and let out a heavy sigh. "It's been like this for months. Ever since she realized she could get away with it. No one stands up to her. If they do, they either get fired or have their hours cut. Most of the staff can't afford to lose this job." Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. "And you?" he asked. "Why do you stay?" Sophia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't have a choice. I'm paying for my mom's medical bills, and this job barely covers the rent. I've tried looking for something else, but no one's hiring right now, so here I am, taking Carol's crap every day because I don't have any other option." Quote, dot. There was a pause as they both stood in the alley, the distant sounds of the city filling the silence. Marcus glanced at her, noticing the tired lines under her eyes, the way she seemed worn down by more than just the physical demands of the job. She was mentally exhausted, constantly on edge, fearing Carol's next outburst. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "You deserve better than that." Sophia shrugged again, though her expression softened slightly. "It is what it is. We all just put up with it because we need the paycheck. Carol knows that. She knows we're trapped." Before Marcus could respond, the back door opened and Carlos stepped out, wiping his hands on his apron. He nodded at both of them, giving Marcus a weary smile. "You're still here, Mark?" Carlos asked, leaning against the wall next to them. "Guess Carol hasn't scared you off yet." Marcus shook his head. "Nah, not yet, though I'm starting to see what you guys mean." Carlos exchanged a glance with Sophia before sighing. "It's been bad for a while now. I've tried talking to her, tried getting her to ease up on the staff, but she doesn't listen. She's too focused on squeezing every penny out of the restaurant, and if that means making everyone's life hell, then so be it." Sophia nodded in agreement, flicking the ash off her cigarette. "She's been cutting corners left and right, reusing ingredients, slashing portion sizes, and telling us to ignore complaints from certain types of customers if they're not white or wealthy. She doesn't care." Marcus frowned, his frustration simmering. "Doesn't anyone report her? I mean, the way she treats people, it's not right." Carlos grimaced. "Who would we report her to? The owner's never around. He checks in from time to time, but Carol knows how to play nice when he's here, and with the way the economy's been, no one wants to rock the boat. We're just trying to get by." Marcus bit his tongue, resisting the urge to reveal his true identity. Now wasn't the time. He had to keep listening, keep gathering information. But every word from Carlos and Sophia only confirmed what he already knew. Carol's abuse wasn't just limited to her treatment of the staff. It was affecting the quality of the restaurant, the customer experience, and, most importantly, the morale of the entire team. "We're all hanging by a thread here," Sophia said, her voice quieter now. "Everyone's too scared to say anything because we can't afford to lose our jobs. But we're all miserable. We just hope that one day someone will actually notice and do something about it." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stared out into the dark alley, his mind racing. Someone had noticed, and that someone was him. And soon, he was going to do something about it. As the clock ticked closer to closing time, Marcus continued to work at the dish station, his body tired, but his mind sharp, taking in every detail. The kitchen was starting to wind down, but the tension hadn't lifted. In fact, it seemed worse. The line cooks were quieter than usual, their movements tight with stress. Marcus noticed Carlos looking more tense than before, his brow furrowed as he cleaned his station. Carol strode into the kitchen, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for a new target. The servers and kitchen staff immediately straightened, as though they knew something was coming. "Carlos," she called, her voice sharp. "We need to talk about costs." Carlos glanced up from his work, visibly tired. "What about them?" Carol marched over to the service counter, holding up a plate of roasted lamb that had been prepared for the next order. "This," she said, pointing to the lamb, "is too big. You're giving them too much for the price. We can't afford to be this generous." Carlos frowned. "That's the portion size we've always used. It's the standard for this dish." Carol's lips curled into a sneer. "Not anymore. From now on, you're cutting the portions by 25%. The kitchen went silent, the only sound the quiet sizzle of food cooking on the grill. Marcus paused, his eyes narrowing as he watched the exchange. Reducing portion sizes for a high-end dish like the lamb would be a clear rip-off for the customers, especially given the price they were paying. It was one thing to control costs, but this was exploitation. Carlos sat down his tongs, frustration etched on his face. "Customers are going to notice, Carol. They're paying good money for these dishes." Carol crossed her arms, her expression cold. "Let them. If they have a problem, we'll offer a half-hearted apology and send them a free dessert or a glass of wine. We're not in the business of pleasing every complainer. We're in the business of making money." Carlos looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew better. His jaw tightened, and he nodded stiffly. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "We'll cut the portions." Marcus felt his anger rise. Carol wasn't just treating her staff like dirt. Now she was actively sabotaging the customer experience, all in the name of padding the restaurant's profits. She was willing to destroy the reputation of Turner's Table just to save a few dollars. And it infuriated him. This wasn't the restaurant he had built. This wasn't what his brand stood for. Carol didn't stop there. She turned her attention to one of the line cooks, Raoul, who was preparing a seafood risotto. Raoul's hands moved deftly, tossing the shrimp into the pan with a skill that came from years of experience. "Hold on!" Carol snapped, walking over to inspect his station. She peered into the pan, her eyes narrowing. "Are those the jumbo shrimp?" Raoul looked up, confused. "Yes, ma'am. They're for the special." Carol shook her head, annoyed. "No more jumbo shrimp. From now on, we're using the smaller ones. They're cheaper." Raoul hesitated, his brow furrowing. "But the menu says the special comes with jumbo shrimp. It's been like that for months." "I don't care what the menu says," Carol replied, her tone curt. "The customers will eat what we give them. Most of them won't even notice." Raoul glanced over at Carlos, clearly unsure of what to do. Carlos gave him a resigned nod. "Just do what she says," he said quietly. Raoul, looking defeated, tossed the smaller shrimp into the pan, shaking his head. Marcus clenched his fists as he rinsed another dish. This was going too far. Carol was systematically cutting quality across the board, all while charging customers premium prices. She didn't care about the reputation of the restaurant, the experience of the customers, or the pride the kitchen staff took in their work. All she cared about was squeezing every possible dollar out of the business, no matter the cost to the people who worked for her or the patrons who dined there. And the worst part, Carol acted as if she would never be held accountable for her actions. She believed that the staff's silence and the customers' ignorance were enough to protect her from any consequences. But she was wrong. Marcus watched as the kitchen staff returned to their work, the atmosphere even heavier than before. Carol, satisfied with her new directives, retreated back to the front of the house, leaving behind a room full of frustrated and defeated employees. He couldn't wait much longer. Carol's toxic management and greed were poisoning his restaurant, and if he let this go on, it would be too late to repair the damage. As the night went on, Marcus made a decision. He had seen enough. It was time to act. The kitchen was buzzing again, but not with the same energy Marcus had felt during the dinner rush. Instead, it felt tense and uncertain, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The staff were tired, beaten down by the long shift and Carol's relentless orders. Marcus worked in silence, scrubbing the dishes while keeping an eye on the chaos around him. Just when he thought the night couldn't get any worse, Carol's sharp voice cut through the din, this time coming from the dining room. "Make sure to seat them by the kitchen," Carol ordered the hostess, her voice low but filled with an air of superiority. Marcus glanced up from the dish pit, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Carol through the swinging door that led to the dining area. She was pointing toward a black couple who had just entered the restaurant. They were dressed nicely, the man in a blazer and the woman in a beautiful dress, clearly looking forward to a nice evening out. But something about the way Carol looked at them set off alarm bells in Marcus's head. The hostess hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the directive. "But Miss Simmons, the tables near the windows are open," she said softly, glancing at the prime seating area where other couples, mostly white, were enjoying their meals. Carol waved her hand dismissively. "I don't care. Seat them by the kitchen. We're saving the good tables for more important guests." Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched the couple being led to the back of the restaurant, near the kitchen, when there were better tables available. It was the worst spot in the house. Loud, disruptive, and far from the elegant ambiance most customers expected when they dined at Turner's Table. And it was clear to Marcus why they had been placed there. It wasn't just a bad table. It was a deliberate message. The couple sat down, exchanging confused glances, but remaining polite. Marcus could see the frustration in their eyes as they looked around the restaurant and realized they were the only ones seated in the back, away from the rest of the diners. Carol, meanwhile, sauntered back into the kitchen, her face expressionless as if she hadn't just deliberately disrespected paying customers. Marcus had seen enough. He set down the dish he was scrubbing and leaned against the sink, watching through the small window in the door as the couple quietly discussed their situation. Things quickly went from bad to worse. Their waiter, a young man who looked nervous and flustered, approached the couple's table. Marcus could hear bits and pieces of the conversation as he passed by. "I'm really sorry about the wait. Your food will be out soon," the waiter said, his voice shaky. The couple nodded politely, but it was clear they were growing frustrated. They had been sitting for nearly half an hour, and no food had arrived. Meanwhile, Marcus noticed that the other tables were being served promptly, their meals arriving within minutes of ordering. Marcus's hands tightened into fists. He knew what was happening. Carol had instructed the kitchen to deprioritize their order, probably assuming that the couple wouldn't make a fuss. It was a blatant act of discrimination, one that Marcus had seen in other places but never in his own restaurant. When their food finally arrived, Marcus saw the waiter hesitate before placing the plates in front of them. The lamb was cold, the sauce congealed. Marcus didn't need to taste it to know that it had been sitting under the heat lamps far too long. The woman gently raised her hand, signaling to the waiter. Her voice was calm, but Marcus could see the disappointment on her face. "Excuse me, this isn't very warm. Would it be possible to send it back?" The waiter, clearly flustered, stammered, "I'll go talk to the kitchen." Carol was there in an instant, her face set in a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice cold and patronizing. The man looked up at her, his brow furrowed. "Yes, our food is cold. We've been waiting a long time, and it seems like there was some mix-up with our order." Carol didn't even blink. "I'm sorry if the food isn't to your liking," she said, her tone dismissive, "but I assure you our kitchen staff work hard to deliver quality meals. Perhaps next time you could make a reservation earlier to ensure better service." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. Carol was blaming the customers for her own deliberate mistreatment. The woman exchanged a glance with her partner, clearly not wanting to make a scene, but the tension between them was palpable. Before the couple could respond, Carol continued, "If you're unhappy, I'd be happy to comp a drink or offer dessert, but as you can see, we're very busy tonight." She gestured around the room, though it was obvious that most of the tables were already being served without issue. The couple didn't argue, but the disappointment on their faces spoke volumes. They finished their meal in silence, barely touching their plates. Marcus felt his blood boil. This wasn't just about bad service. It was about Carol's racist assumptions and her complete disregard for anyone who didn't fit her idea of what a real customer should look like. As soon as Carol turned her back, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Watching her mistreat staff was bad enough, but this was crossing a line he couldn't ignore. This was his breaking point. Marcus couldn't get the image of the black couple out of his mind. Their quiet dignity, the way they had tried not to make a scene even as they were disrespected and mistreated, it gnawed at him. He had built Turner's Table to be a place of inclusion and community, a space where anyone, regardless of background, could enjoy a luxurious dining experience. And now, the very person he had trusted to manage that vision was trampling all over it. As the kitchen staff cleaned up for the night, Marcus wiped his hands on a towel and headed for the locker room in the back, his heart pounding. He had been undercover for days now, absorbing every insult, every injustice, every corner Carol cut. But tonight had been the final straw. Tomorrow, he would confront Carol. No more pretending. He pulled off his work apron and slipped into a worn hoodie, blending in as one of the last dishwashers to leave for the night. But as he exited through the back door, his mind was already racing with plans. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't just about getting rid of Carol, it was about repairing the damage she had done. The conference room at Turner's Table headquarters was spacious and sleek, with polished glass walls and a long wooden table at its center. The view of the Manhattan skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows was stunning, but Marcus barely noticed it. He sat at the head of the table, his calm demeanor masking the storm of thoughts brewing within him. Today was the day. Across from him, his assistant Renee stood near the door, ready to escort Carol into the room when she arrived. Marcus had requested the meeting under the pretense of discussing future goals and performance improvements, which he knew Carol would expect to be a praise-filled evaluation. But today wasn't about praise. It was about consequences. "Mr. Turner, Miss Simmons is here," Renee said softly, her voice measured and professional. Marcus nodded, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt as he sat up straight. "Bring her in." A few seconds later, the door opened, and Carol walked into the room with her usual confident stride. She was dressed in a sharp blazer and heels, her expression smooth but with a hint of curiosity. She clearly wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," Carol said with a polite smile, extending her hand. "I wasn't expecting to meet with you this early in the quarter. What's on the agenda today?" Marcus shook her hand briefly, his eyes locking with hers. "Please take a seat, Carol." Carol sat down across from him, her posture poised and confident, like someone who believed they were in control of the situation. She placed her tablet on the table, no doubt expecting to run through sales numbers and performance metrics. "Thank you for coming in today," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "There are a few important matters we need to discuss, more than just the usual numbers." Carol tilted her head slightly, her smile still in place. "Of course. I'm happy to go over anything you need, Mr. Turner. The restaurant has been performing well, and I've been working hard to keep costs down, just like you requested." Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, then leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Carol's. "There was a new hire at the restaurant recently, wasn't there?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a subtle edge. "A dishwasher, Mark, I believe." Carol blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yes, I remember. He just started a few days ago," she said, her tone uncertain. "What about him?" Marcus tilted his head ever so slightly, studying her reaction. "Funny thing about Mark," his words hung in the air, drawing out the moment. "He's been working hard, keeping his head down, blending in. I'm sure you didn't pay him much attention." Carol's confusion deepened, and a flicker of unease passed across her face. "I mean, he's just a dishwasher," she said, her voice faltering. Marcus kept his tone steady, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his next words. "Mark," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "is me." For a moment, the room seemed to still. Carol's eyes widened, her body stiffening in her chair. She blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to process what she just heard. "What?" she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus leaned forward, his expression calm but cold. "I've been undercover, Carol," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. "I've been working in the kitchen, observing how things are run, watching how you treat the staff, how you handle the day-to-day operations. And what I've seen is not just disappointing, it's unacceptable." Carol's face drained of color. She sat up straighter, her face rigid, her confident facade crumbling as she realized the gravity of the situation. I didn't know," she stammered. "If I had known it was you, Mr. Turner." Marcus cut her off, his voice firm. "That's exactly the problem, Carol. You shouldn't have to know it's me to treat people with basic decency." Carol opened her mouth to speak, but Marcus wasn't finished. "I watched you berate the staff, good hard-working people who deserve respect, not abuse. I saw you cut corners, mistreat customers, and create a toxic environment where employees live in fear of losing their jobs if they step out of line." "I've been running the restaurant the best I can," Carol interjected, her voice shaky but defensive. "Sometimes being strict is necessary to keep things running smoothly." "Strict?" Marcus's tone hardened. "What you've been is abusive. Carol, you've pushed good employees to their breaking point. I've seen how you treat people based on their appearance, their background. I watched you seat a black couple at the worst table in the restaurant, near the kitchen, when there were better tables available. And when they asked for better service, you ignored their request and blamed them for not making an early reservation." Carol's hands trembled as she clasped them together on the table, her eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Turner, that's not how it was. I was managing the seating based on reservations." "Enough," Marcus snapped, his voice steady but final. "I've seen enough. The way you treat both the staff and the customers in my restaurant is not just unprofessional, it's disgraceful. Security will escort you out, and you'll receive instructions on the termination process." Carol's breath caught in her throat. "What?" she gasped, her voice high and desperate. "You can't be serious. I've been with this company for years. You can't just fire me over some—" "This is not up for discussion," Marcus said, his voice cold and resolute. "Your behavior has been inexcusable. You've jeopardized the integrity of my restaurant and the well-being of my staff. Security will escort you out, and you'll receive instructions on the termination process." Carol stood abruptly, her face red with anger and disbelief. "You'll regret this, Mr. Turner. I've worked too hard for this. You'll see, you're making a huge mistake." But Marcus didn't flinch. He met her glare with a calm, unwavering stare. "The mistake," he said evenly, "was letting you manage my restaurant for as long as you did." Without another word, Carol stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Marcus watched her go, feeling the tension in his chest finally begin to ease. It was done. Carol was gone, and now it was time to fix what she had broken. The staff gathered in the private meeting room of Turner's table, their faces a mixture of confusion and nervous anticipation. It wasn't often that they were called in for meetings with the owner, let alone the day after such a tumultuous evening. Word had spread quickly that Carol had been fired, but no one knew the full story. There were whispers of what might come next, but all eyes were now on Marcus as he stood at the front of the room. Carlos and Sophia sat toward the back, both looking cautious and uncertain, though Marcus could see a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They, like the rest of the staff, had endured more than their fair share of abuse under Carol's rule. But today, Marcus was here to change that. "Thank you all for coming in today," Marcus began, his voice calm and steady as he addressed the room. "I know the past few months have been difficult. You've had to deal with some pretty toxic behavior, and I want you to know that I've seen it. I've heard your concerns, and I've seen firsthand the way you've been treated." The room was silent, but Marcus could feel the weight of his words settling in. Some of the staff exchanged glances, their shoulders relaxing slightly as they realized Marcus wasn't here to reprimand them. "Carol Simmons is no longer with the company," Marcus continued. "Effective immediately, she has been terminated." A few people in the room gasped, though most had already heard the news. Marcus let the announcement hang in the air for a moment, allowing the reality of it to sink in. Carol was gone. She was not the kind of manager this restaurant deserves, and her behavior was not in line with the value of Turner's Table, Marcus said firmly. "This restaurant was built on respect, teamwork, and inclusivity. Every single person who works here deserves to feel valued and appreciated, and every customer who walks through our doors deserves to feel welcome." Sophia's eyes were wide with surprise, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. Carlos remained stoic, though Marcus could see the relief in his eyes. He had held the kitchen together despite the chaos, and Marcus knew that his loyalty and dedication had not gone unnoticed. "That being said," Marcus continued, "we need strong leadership to move forward. We need leaders who understand what this restaurant stands for, who understand the importance of respect and quality, not just for the customers, but for every single one of you." Marcus glanced toward the back of the room, his gaze settling on Carlos. "Carlos," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "you've been with me for a long time. I've seen your commitment to this restaurant, and I've seen the way you handle pressure, even when things aren't easy. Effective immediately, I'd like to promote you to the role of general manager." Carlos's eyes widened in shock. He sat up straighter, his mouth opening slightly as if to protest. "Mr. Turner, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take the job," Marcus said with a small smile. "You've earned it." Carlos swallowed, his eyes misting over with gratitude. "Yes, Mr. Turner, I'll take it. Thank you. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Marcus replied warmly before turning his attention to Sophia. "And Sophia, you've endured more than anyone should have to. You've shown incredible resilience, and it hasn't gone unnoticed. I'd like to promote you to assistant manager. You'll work alongside Carlos to ensure that this restaurant becomes the place it was always meant to be." Sophia's face flushed with surprise, her hand covering her mouth. "Me? Assistant manager?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," Marcus said firmly. "You have the strength and the heart for it, and I trust you." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I'll do my best. I won't let you down." Marcus smiled, feeling the tension in the room lift. The staff began to murmur among themselves, their expressions a mix of relief and excitement. Change was coming, and it was starting with the people who truly deserved the chance to lead. Later that afternoon, Marcus stood in the now empty dining area, watching as the last few customers left satisfied with their meals. The mood in the restaurant was lighter than it had been in months. The news of Carol's firing had spread quickly, and the staff moved with a renewed sense of energy and hope. There was no more walking on eggshells, no more tension in the air. As Marcus watched, he noticed Carlos calmly giving instructions to the waitstaff, his usual quiet authority now matched with a genuine smile. Sophia moved through the tables, chatting with customers and fellow workers alike, making sure every detail was perfect. Marcus noticed how the younger staff members looked to her for guidance and how she gave them encouragement without hesitation. She had become the supportive leader the restaurant had desperately needed. The inclusivity and customer service training had gone off without a hitch. In fact, it had opened up a space for the staff to share their experiences and support each other in a way that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Morale had improved dramatically, and even customers had begun to notice the change. The restaurant's reviews were glowing, praising not just the food, but the kindness and attentiveness of the staff. A familiar voice pulled Marcus out of his thoughts. "Mr. Turner, it's great to see you here tonight." He turned to see Sophia standing by his table, her smile bright and genuine. "Sophia," Marcus said warmly, "it's great to be here. Things look like they're running smoothly." "They are," Sophia said, her pride evident in her voice. "The team is really coming together. We're already getting feedback from customers about how much they love the new energy here." "That's good to hear," Marcus replied. "I knew you and Carlos could turn things around." Sophia nodded. "Carlos has been amazing. He's really helped set a new tone in the kitchen. The staff are more motivated, more comfortable. It feels like we're finally building something strong here, something that reflects what you wanted all along." Marcus smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping for." As Sophia excused herself to check on a table, Marcus took a deep breath, letting the familiar sense of the kitchen, the roasted meats, the herbs, the warm bread, fill the air. He felt a sense of pride settle in his chest. The restaurant was finally back on track, its true spirit restored. He had come so close to losing everything to Carol's toxic influence, but now, under the leadership of Carlos and Sophia, it was clear the restaurant had a bright future ahead. Across the room, Carlos caught Marcus's eye and gave him a brief nod of gratitude. Marcus returned it, knowing that the hard work wasn't over, but that they were on the right path. As the evening wore on, Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching the flow of the restaurant with quiet satisfaction. There was a peace in knowing that the restaurant was in good hands, hands that would nurture it, respect it, and help it grow. His vision had always been to create not just a place of luxury, but a place of inclusivity and respect. And tonight, as he watched his staff and customers alike enjoy the evening, he knew that vision was finally being realized. Marcus stood up, taking one last look around the dining room before heading for the door. As he left Turner's table and stepped into the cool evening air, a sense of calm washed over him. The restaurant was more than just a business. It was a reflection of his values. And now those values were being honored. There was still work to be done, of course. There always would be. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt at peace, knowing that his restaurant was a place where everyone, staff and customers alike, could thrive.